Well, let's welcome ourselves to the last years of the American century, but it's been an unmitigated disaster. America has been thriving on having an enemy, and this is following the 20-year war that we've had in Afghanistan, and it needs to construct a new one. On February 17th of 1941, less than 10 months before the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor and the U.S. found itself in a global war, um, Henry Luce, in an editorial piece in Life magazine, which he founded along with Time and Fortune, declared the years to come as the American century. He then urged this country's leaders to exert upon the world the full impact of our influence for such purposes as we see fucking fit. And he wasn't wrong about it, was he? Eight, 8 decades later, who would deny that we've lived through something like an American century after all? In 1945, the U.S. emerged triumphant from World War II, which was a rare nation remarkably unravaged by that war, despite the 400,000 casualties it had suffered. With Great Britain heading for the imperial sub-basement, Washington found itself instantly the military and economic powerhouse on the planet. And as it turned out, however, to exert upon the world the full impact of our influence, one other thing that we found necessary and unfortunately at hand was an enemy. From then on, America's global stature and power would, in fact, be eternally based on facing down our enemies. Fortunately, in 1945, there was that other potential, if the war-ravaged powerhouse, the Soviet Union. That future superpower had been an ally in World War II, but no longer. It would thereafter be the necessary enemy in a Cold War that sometimes threatened to turn all too hot, and it would, of course, ensure that that what later came to be known as the military-industrial complex and a nuclear arsenal capable of destroying many planets like this one would be funded in a way once historically inconceivable and what still have passed for peacetime. In 1991, however, after a disastrous war in Afghanistan, the Soviet Empire finally collapsed in an economic ruin. As it went down, hosannas of triumph rang out in a surprised Washington. Henry Luce, who was by then dead almost a quarter of a century, would undoubtedly have been thrilled. Um, in the meantime, in those cold verging on the hot water wars, the U.S. ruled the roost in what became known as the free world, while its corporations came to economically dominate much of the planet. And though it would be a true global imperial power with hundreds of military bases scattered across every continent but Antarctica, there would prove to be significant limits to that power, and I'm not just thinking of the Soviet Union or its communist ally, the later opponent, Mao Zedong's China. At the edges of what was then called third world, whether in Southeast Asia during and after the disastrous Vietnam War, or in Iran after 1979, the American power often enough came a cropper in memorable ways, and still in those years on a planet some 25,000 miles in circumference, Washington certainly had a remarkable reach, and in 1991, when the Soviet Union disappeared, it seemed as if Luce had been a prophet of the First Order. After all, the United States, as the ultimate imperial power, had, or so at least it appeared at that moment, been left without even a major power. Um, no less another superpower as an enemy on a planet that looked at least to those in Washington like it was ours for the taking, and indeed take it we soon enough would try to do so anyway. But no wonder, in those years, American politicians and key officials filled the airwaves with self-congratulation and self-praise for what they like to think of most as the most exceptional and indispensable greatest power on the planet, and sure to remain so forever and a day. In another sense, however, problems loomed instantly. Things were so desperate for the military-industrial complex in a country that was promised a cut in defense spending, then known as a peace dividend, thanks to the triumph over the Soviets, that enemies had to be created out of a whole cloth, and they were, it turned out, fundamental to the organization of American global power. A world without them was essentially inconceivable, or at least inconvenient beyond imagining, and hence the usefulness of Iraqi autocrat Saddam Hussein, who would be the not quite taken down in the first Gulf War of 1991, and perhaps the classic example of the desperate need to create these enemies, however, would occur early in the next century. Remember the axis of evil announced and denounced by the then President George W. Bush in his January 2002 State of the Union address? He called out three states: Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, that then had not the slightest the slightest way of injuring the U.S. States like these and their terrorist allies insisted that the president constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace out of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger, and they could provide these arms to terrorists, given them the means to match their hatred. And they could attack our allies or attempt to blackmail the United States. In any of these cases, the price of indifference would be catastrophic. But of course, this was in part based on the claim that Iraqi might have such weapons of mass destruction, which it didn't, and that it would in turn be willing to give them to terror groups to attack the U.S., and that lie would become part of the basis for the invasion of that country the following year. Think of this as the strangest kind of imperial desperation from a superpower that seemed to have it all. And the result, of course, after Osama bin Laden launched the Air Force and those 19 mostly Saudi hijackers against New York and Washington on 9/11, it was the global war on terror, which would soon prove a self-imposed, self-created disaster. Or think of it another way: when considering the imperial fates of America and this fucking planet, the crew who ran in Washington and the U.S. military then proved, as it would be true throughout the first 2 decades of the 21st century, incapable of learning even the most basic lessons history has to offer. After all, only a decade after the Soviet Union collapsed, and thanks in a significant part to what its leader called its bleeding wound, a disastrous war in Afghanistan, in which the Red Army became endlessly mirrored. The Bush administration would launch its own disastrous war in Afghanistan, in which it would become endlessly mirrored. It was as if this country, in its moment of triumph, couldn't help but take the Soviet path into the future, and the one heading for the exits. Now we look to November of 2021. Now, just 3 decades after the implosion of the Soviet Union, no one could imagine any longer that such a vision of victory and success to come caught the underlying realities of this country or this century. The arrival of Donald Trump in the White House 5 years earlier had been the most visible proof of that. It's hard to imagine today that he wasn't the truest of all products of that very American century, a genuine message from it to us and the rest of the world. He was, after all, the man who in his key slogan in 2016 as the country's first declinist candidate for squatter, "Make America Hate Again," suggested that it had been all over for a while when it came to this country being the first player in history. He had in fact been coughed up by an authoritarian system already in formation. He bolted into squatting in the White House and not just claiming that the American system was a fraud, but that it lost its firstness and its greatness. In response to that message, so many Americans who felt that they too had lost their way, and that they were in fact being crushed for history, voted for him because they were dumbasses. But in the mere 4 years in the time he was squatting in the White House, he would bring a true sense of eneminess home in a new and shattering way, creating a world in which the enemy was distinctly American and needed to be overthrown. The topsy-turvy of the Trumpian version of the American century is something that this country and certainly the Biden administration still hasn't fully come to grips with. For decades, we had indeed led the rest of the world, and this is what we had led them into: the conspiracy theory of history, almost any conspiracy theory you want to mention, the fraudulent election now being eternally denounced by Trump, the coup attempt of January 6th, the Republican Party that's become the opposition from hell, a planet on which fossil fuel companies, often American, knew decades ago just what was happening with the climate and invested their extra funds in making sure that other Americans didn't. But wait, why go on? If you don't sense the depth and the truth of this tale of the American century, just ask the closet Republican Joe Manchin. Its final decades seem to be a time when this country's politicians can hardly agree on anything, including how to keep Americans safe in a pandemic moment. Check out the New York Times COVID-19 global hotspots map, and then in these last months it looks like a replay of the Cold War, since the U.S. and Russia are the 2 largest hotspots of death and destruction on the planet, which with each colored a wild red. Think of it as a new kind of hot war. And little wonder at the confusion of it all. I mean, talk about a superpower that proved incapable of learning from history. In response to the slaughter of 3,000 Americans on 9/11, and mind you, something like 3,000 Americans were being slaughtered every 2 days most of this year, thanks in part to the murderous leadership of the various Trumpian figures in this pandemic moment. The greatest power ever decided that the only response imaginable to 9/11 was to launch its own war in Afghanistan, and thank you, Soviet Union, for your example, and not to speak of our own example in Vietnam back then. And yes, 20 years later, on a planet far more filled with Islamist terrorist groups than might have seemed even faintly imaginable on September 11th of 2001, a failure is just another word for a new Cold War. Oh yes, in 2021, there is indeed another power rising on this planet, one it's necessary to organize against with all due haste, or to the Biden administration and the U.S. military would like us to believe. And no, I'm not thinking about the power of a fast-heating climate, which threatens to take us down, to take down anyone's century. I'm thinking, of course, about China. As we head into the final 2 decades of the all-American era that Luce predicted, think about this: the American century has been a disaster of the first order. In the wake of the implosion of the Soviet Union, the U.S. decided to remake the world and did so, at least in the sense of allowing climate change to run riot on planet Earth, while in the process unmaking itself. So 80 years later, after Henry Luce proclaimed its existence, welcome indeed to the American century, or rather go to the increasingly nightmarish planet that it's left us on. Welcome to an age of billionaires that could even one day see itself as being a trillionaire, and to levels of desperate inequality that would once have been imaginable here, to large-scale death due to a pandemic from hell mismanaged by men who were functionally murderers, and to a literally hellish future that without the kind of war style mobilization that the closet Republican Joe Manchin, among others, is ensuring will never happen. And it was sooner rather than later they enveloped this country and the planet it meant to rule in a climate disaster. And honestly, could the Chinese century, not that it's likely, given how the world is trending, be worse? You don't even have to leave this country and go to Afghanistan, Iraq, or Somalia, or Yemen to judge that question anymore. And sadly, the one thing the triumphalists of 1991 agreed on, and American politicians have never changed their minds about, no matter the course of our wars, was funding the military-industrial complex in a way that they never would have funded either the bolstering of a human health or the halting of a climate change. And that urge to dump taxpayer dollars into the American war machine, despite failure after failure and war after war, has never been stanched. It remains more or less the only thing congressional Democrats and Republicans can still agree on, that and then the need for an enemy to endlessly prepare to fight. Of course, the imperial power that simply couldn't exist without such enemies, and they have left Afghanistan and much of the rest of its war on terror, despite the odd drone strike that happened, largely in the lurch as in the process of creating its newest enemy for a new age, which is China. But think of the new Cold War that the Biden administration, like the Trump administration before him, has been promoting as 1991 turned upside down when it comes to eneminess. This ultimate moment of American triumph and then of despair both needed their distant enemies, and it's an ever more and it's well financed military industrial congressional complex, and an even more modernized nuclear arsenal. On the hubris of it all, we were the country that would remake the world in our image. We would bring liberation and democracy to the Afghans and the Iraqis, among others, and glory to this land. In the end, of course, we brought them little but pain, displacement, and death, while bringing American democracy itself, with all its failings, to the autocratic edge of hell in a world of fraudulent elections and a coupster galore. Now it seems we are truly living out of the end of American century in the world it created, and who would have fucking thunk it? So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.